Tonight's lecture is over human populations. Back in 1988, a swarm of volunteers descended on Ernakulam, a city of about 3 million people in the state of Kerala, India. They were on a mission to teach as many people as possible to read and write, and they were not leaving any stone unturned. According to the New York Times, classes were held in cowsheds, in the open air, and in courtyards. For fishermen, volunteers went to the seashore. In the hills, tribal groups sat on rocks. Leprosy patients were taught to hold a pencil in stumps of their hands with rubber bands. India is the world's most populous nation. Its huge and still rapidly growing population must find ways to stem population growth in a world and country quickly running low on resources. Like much of India, Kerala, a small bean-shaped state tucked into the southwest corner of India, is both very poor and very crowded. The average Keralan earns just 1/70th of what the average U.S. citizen earns and lives in just half the space of the average resident of New Jersey. New Jersey is the most densely populated U.S. state with about 1,200 people per square mile. But Kerala has some unique features that set it apart from other equally poor and crowded places. Women tend to be more educated and have more power, and decent health care is the norm for all citizens. Moving on, the Ernakulam campaign made Kerala the first fully literate state in all of India, but it also brought about another success, one that stretched far beyond the volunteers' makeshift classrooms. As literacy rates went up in Kerala, the state's population stopped growing so quickly. The achievement was so unprecedented that economists came up with the new term to describe it, the Kerala model. To understand the relationship between literacy and population growth, we must first take a closer look at the nature of human populations and the forces that cause them to grow and shrink. And that brings us to key concept number 1. The human population grew very slowly for most of human history. Only recently have accelerated growth rates sent our population soaring past 7 billion. World population is projected to stabilize near 11 billion, and we're expecting that to happen around 2100 at the current rate of growth. So global population rate is a measure of how quickly a population will increase in size. Right now, global population size is the largest that it's ever been, and the growth rate is very high. For most of human history, our population size was orders of magnitude smaller than it is now. And that brings us to the agricultural revolution. This is a prehistoric transition from hunter-gatherer societies that were small and nomadic-like to farming societies that were stationary and larger. This led to the first dramatic increase in the number of people for 2 reasons. First, it enabled us to produce more food and feed more people. Second, it created a greater need for human labor. Because they take a lot of work to run, farms created an incentive for people to have more children. With farms, people also ate better and lived longer. As a result, death rates dropped, birth rates stayed high, and the number of people increased. But this did not happen indefinitely. Before long, population growth slowed, and human population size held steady at around 100 million people for centuries. Population grew slowly from the Bronze Age through the Middle Ages, punctuated by a dip caused by the Black Death in Europe, until the next revolution, the Industrial Revolution. This led to dramatic improvements in agriculture, which increased food supplies, and sanitation, which decreased the spread of diseases. Advancements in healthcare, too, improved survival. Those changes drove the death rates down even further and spurred the next, even more extreme wave of population growth. However, more recently, Earth has witnessed yet another surge in human population growth as the improvements in the provision of food, healthcare, and sanitation brought on by the Industrial Revolution have spread from developed countries like the United States to developing ones like India and China. These advances have enabled people in all countries to live longer than ever before. Life expectancy at birth has more than doubled since 1800, when it was less than 30 years of age. According to the United Nations, in 2019, life expectancy at birth was age 72 worldwide and age 65 in less developed countries. Many countries have life expectancies in the low 80s. The highest 2019 value was that of Japan at age 84. The United States came in at age 79. Even the country with the lowest life expectancy today, which is the Central African Republic, which comes in at age 53, exceeds that of countries with the highest life expectancies in 1800. Still, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that some countries have life expectancies considerably lower than others, highlighting the need to actively work toward addressing the health threats each faces. In 1950, world population was 2.5 billion. In 1972, it reached 3.85 billion, and by 2019, it had doubled, topping 7.7 billion. We are adding about 500 million people every 6 years. So, still increasing, and very quickly in some areas, overall human population is growing at a slower rate than it was in the mid-20th century, thanks to decreases in birth rates. Annual global growth rates peaked around 1963 at 2.2% and slowly decreased to the current level just over 1%. And 1.1% in 2019. Though a clear growth rate of barely more than 1% doesn't sound like much, if our growth rate stayed the same, by 2100 there would be more than 21 billion people on the planet Earth. Future projections assume lesser growth rates, predict human population size will stabilize somewhere between 7.3 billion. Note, this is a decline, and 15.6 billion by the year 2100. The mid-range projection of 10.9 billion is believed to be the most likely scenario. Where we eventually stabilize will depend largely on how quickly we reach a stasis, where death and birth rates even out. That stasis is referred to as zero population growth. Because of concerns about how many people the planet can support and what will happen if the population growth goes unchecked, zero population growth has long been the goal of many individual countries around the world, including India. And that brings us to our infographic number 1 on page 143. The projected population size in 2050 and beyond will largely depend on future growth rates and may stabilize around 11 billion. If population growth rates do not decline as quickly as expected, a high-end estimate puts our population at more than 15.6 billion by the year 2100. And that brings us to our key concept number 2. More than 8 billion people inhabit planet Earth. Close to 60% live in just 10 countries. Almost 40% of people live in China and India. So in general, the distribution of humans around the world is widely uneven. Worldwide, most human populations are located close to the ocean or major rivers, and slightly more than 55% live in cities. More than half live in Asia, and the vast majority live in just 10 countries. The two most populous countries, India and China, stand out. Each of them has more than 4 times the population of the United States, the next largest country. Population distribution in the United States is also quite variable. Following the global pattern, around 50% live near coastal areas. In addition, regions east of the Mississippi River tend to be more population dense than western regions. The population of any given country is determined by a myriad of factors, including migration, that is, the movement of people in and out of countries, When the people migrate into a population, it is called immigration. When they migrate out, it is called emigration. People are motivated to move away from negative situations like war, discrimination, or toward new opportunities such as jobs, better farmland, or it's often a combination of both. Immigration is expected to drive most future population growth in the United States. Globally, most migration is immigration to cities. As of 2008, more people lived in urban areas than in rural ones. In recent history, leaders of China and India have employed some desperate attempts to curb population growth within their borders, in large part because they are or were growing beyond their ability to feed themselves. Many of those efforts were coercive. Beginning in 1979, the Chinese government prohibited families from having more than one child. The government vowed to deny state-funded education and health care to all but the firstborn child. Parents who didn't comply risked losing their jobs and faced severe fines and penalties, often several times their annual salary. And earlier, that same decade, the Indian government established forced vasectomy camps across the country. They withheld food ration cards, business licenses, and even water for crop irrigation if men didn't quote-unquote volunteer for sterilization surgery. Women, too, were coerced or paid, a form of coercion for those in poverty, to have sterilization surgery, and this practice continues today, sometimes with tragic consequences when hurried procedures done on women in poor health result in their death. Regardless of how well or poorly these efforts succeed in reducing population growth, most experts agree that they represent human rights violations and that it would be better to find a non-compulsory way to address human reproduction and population growth. It turned out that in Kerala, a densely packed society with a unique culture was doing just that. Around 60% of the world's population live in only 10 countries. Around 35% of all people live in China or India. Population growth in China is slowing, and the population size of India has surpassed it. Future population size increases in the United States are expected to be due to immigration. And in this second half of Infographic 2, we see the 10 most populous countries in the world. And that brings us to our key concept number 3. A variety of pronatalist pressures, such as high infant mortality, lead to higher desired family size, which correlates well with the high population growth rates seen in less developed countries. It is in these areas where most future growth will occur. So demography is the statistical analysis of populations. Demographers evaluate metrics known as demographic factors in an effort to understand how human populations change over time. In simple terms, populations grow when births outnumber deaths. As we saw in Module 2.2, factors that favor births and survival are considered population growth factors, whereas factors that lead to death or reduced reproduction are termed resistance factors. And the factors that affect births and deaths aren't all that different between human populations and those of other species. For instance, disease, famine, and predators, or in our case, war, are resistance factors. Access to clean water, nutritious food, and protection from the elements are examples of growth factors. For humans, a decrease in resistance factors and an increase in growth factors have contributed to our phenomenal population growth over the past century or so. Moving on, demographic factors tend to differ substantially between more developed countries, that is, those with a moderate to high standard of living on average, and less developed countries, that is, those with a weak economy and a lower standard of living than a developed country. For example, the crude birth rate, that is the number of offspring per 1,000 individuals, is, on average, more than 3 times as high in less developed countries compared to developed ones. But in some countries, it's much higher than this average. Niger has the highest crude birth rate in the world. That is almost 4 times higher than that of the United States. Meanwhile, the crude death rate, that is the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals per year, is less variable worldwide. In 2019, it was 7.5 per 1,000 people for the planet as a whole, with an average crude death rate of 7.0 in less developed countries and 10.2 in more developed countries. A higher death rate is found in those developed countries that have an aging population, that is, more elderly people in their population. Because of their high birth rates, by far, most current and future population growth is occurring and will continue to occur in developing nations. So as much as demographic factors can differ between locations, they do not tend to be influenced by the same forces everywhere. Health, especially for children, education, especially of females, economic conditions, culture, and religion all work together to determine a country's desired fertility, that is, the number of children the average couple says they want to have. So these same factors strongly affect the total fertility rate, that is, the number of children a woman actually has in her lifetime. As of 2019, the global total fertility rate was 2.5, though, like birth rates, these total fertility rates are highly variable from place to place. Desired fertility and total fertility rates tend to closely track one another, meaning that women tend to have the number of children they say they want to have, and both numbers are linked to population growth. As desired fertility rates increases, total fertility rates increases. And as total fertility rate increases, so does population size. So forces that increase desired fertility, meaning they drive people to want more children, are called pro-natalist pressures. These are things like cultural or religious views that favor large families or the need for children to work the farm or care for elderly parents. In many regions where birth rates are high, women may not have access to contraception. This is called an unmet need due to the inability to afford birth control, cultural taboos against its use, or pressure from patriarchal societies that view children as a sign of male fertility. One of the most significant pronatalist pressures in less developed countries like India is the childhood mortality rate. That is the number of children under 5 years of age who die per every 1,000 live births in that year. Many of these deaths occur before age 1, so demographers often speak in terms of the infant mortality rate. Statistics on childhood mortality vary greatly between more and less developed nations, from a high of 123 deaths per 1,000 births in Chad to a low of 2 deaths per 1,000 births in Japan and countries of Scandinavia. The world average of this childhood mortality rate is 40. Higher childhood mortality rates tend to lead to higher desired fertility and thus higher total fertility rates, because couples will have more children to account for the likelihood that some of those children will die young. By the same token, decreasing childhood mortality will decrease birth rates because people tend to have fewer children when those children can be expected to survive. The bottom line, when childhood mortality decreases, so does desired fertility, and as desired fertility falls, so does the total fertility rate. So in the 1970s, the consensus among development experts was that the best way to reduce a given country's total fertility rate was to grow the economy. Raising a country's or state's gross domestic product, the thinking went, would foster a drive among people toward material wealth, which would in turn improve living conditions and lead to lower childhood mortality rates and lower total fertility rates. A rising tide, the reasoning went, would raise all boats. But in the beginning of that decade, Indian economist Amartya Sen and his colleagues began arguing for a different approach. Build development policies around quality of life, not economic growth. Sen, who would go on to win a Nobel Prize for his work, used Kerala as a prime example. The state had a low GDP, but high literacy rates, and even its poorest citizens enjoyed wide access to child and maternal health clinics, which offered birth control and nutritional assistance. Even as the economy stagnated, this unprecedented access to healthcare and education, especially for women, was driving population growth down and quality of life up. In the 1950s, the population growth rate in Kerala had been one of the highest in India, but in the 1970s, it was beginning to fall. The rate at which children must be born to replace the previous generation, that is, replacement fertility, was reached around 1987, and within 2 decades, the state had achieved sub-replacement fertility. Global replacement fertility is 2.1 children per woman rather than 2 because not all children survive and not all couples have children. Kerala's achievements are impressive. The lowest birth and death rates, lowest childhood mortality rate, and the highest life expectancy at birth, that is age 75.1 years in all of India. Sen might be onto something. More and more social scientists are arguing that monetary wealth or economic growth is the wrong gauge of societal progress and well-being. The GDP of a nation goes up, for example, when air pollution increases health costs for the population. This may be good for the economy, but it is not good for society. The goal of striving for a high quality of life for all citizens was formalized by Bhutan in the 1970s. They seek to increase the gross national happiness with a balanced approach that integrates economic development and cultural and environmental protections. The United Nations recognized the importance of this by signing a resolution that calls for the pursuit of more equitable approach to economic growth that considers the happiness and well-being of all people. The resolution established March 20th as International Happiness Day. Of course, reducing the total fertility rate did not immediately solve Kerala's overpopulation problem. 2 decades after reaching replacement fertility, the state is still waiting to reach zero population growth. The reasons have to do with the breakdown of the population by age and its sex ratio, the proportion of male to females. Remember, the United Nations is an organization ran by governments of elite people. So of course they're going to argue that we should keep wealth out of the hands of poor people. So while these wealthy elite people of the United Nations flying around in their jets with these huge carbon footprints are promoting gross national happiness and International Happiness Day, to me it seems like they're only trying to keep wealth out of the hands of the poorest people. And I'm not saying that wealth buys happiness, and maybe in some ways it does, but there's nothing wrong with being wealthy and happy at the same time. It's the age-old adage. I remember my grandparents saying this when I was a little boy. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The point is, as always, follow the money. And that brings us to infographic 3 on page 147. Most population growth in the recent past has occurred in developing countries, and it is there that most future growth will occur. The pronatalist pressures that increase population growth rates can be economic, social, cultural, or related to family health, because actual fertility closely matches desired family size. Steps that decrease desired family size are the key to reducing high birth rates in many developing countries. And that brings us to key concept number 4. Youthful populations have a great deal of population momentum and will continue to grow even if these young people reproduce at replacement rates. So in order to predict a population's future growth, demographers use age structure diagrams. These diagrams illustrate how a given population breaks down by age and gender, showing how many males and females are found in specific age groups. For example, ages 0 to 4, ages 5 to 9, and so on. These data help demographers make predictions about where the population is headed and make inferences about current conditions. For example, a population with mostly young people, like that of Niger, has a great potential for growth because many people are of childbearing age or younger. This population cohort is still or will soon be having children. A population with similar numbers in age classes is fairly stable because those who are born replace those who die. An aging population like that of Japan may even be shrinking if more of the population is found in older, post-reproductive age classes than in younger ones. When a population is poised to continue growing for some time, even as the total fertility rate falls, usually because it has a higher proportion of younger people compared to older people, that society is said to have population momentum. If there are a lot of young women in the population who have not yet given birth to any children, they have the potential to contribute to a population size increase for another generation, even if these individuals reproduce at replacement rates. In other words, there will be far more births than deaths. Many countries in Africa have very young populations, and population momentum will contribute greatly to the expected high population growth in these regions. Kerala has population momentum for two reasons: lots of younger people and lots of females. In fact, Kerala is one of the only states in all of India where women outnumber men. This feature is also a result of its unique approach to health and education. In many patriarchal societies where male children are preferred, girls are aborted or given up for adoption at much higher rates than boys. For example, a study of one Bombay, now Mumbai, clinic found that of 8,000 abortions performed in the early 1900s, only one was of a male fetus. In one report, India's Department of Women and Child Development wrote that to be born female comes perilously close to being born less than human. And it's not just India. In China, where until recently one child per family was strictly enforced, there were 113 boys for every 100 girls. In Kerala, however, because women can receive education, earn income, and hold some power, families keep their girls. Populations that skew older may grow slowly, not grow at all, or even shrink since many or most of the people are past childbearing age. Once they have been industrialized for a while, more developed countries tend to transition to older age distributions. Currently, many industrialized nations, including the United States and many European countries, have top-heavy age structure diagrams with many older people. In many cases, countries struggle to provide for these rapidly aging populations. Japan, home to the world's fastest aging population, is encouraging workers to stay at their jobs well past retirement age to lessen the surge of government spending on retirees. In 2010, to relieve retirement age problems and thus government pension payouts, France raised the retirement age from 60 to 62, sparking riots throughout the nation. In the United States, the prospect of baby boomers' retirement bankrupting Social Security has spurred intense, vitriolic debate. The workforce, too, is being affected in nations with an aging population. In the United States, for example, worries about retirement funding are keeping many older citizens in the workforce, making it harder for younger workers to get started in their careers. At the opposite end of the spectrum, in some areas, there are not enough young people to take over jobs left behind by retirees. China's one-child policy has led economists to predict that the annual size of the labor force aged 20 to 24 would shrink substantially by the year 2020, perhaps by as much as 50%. This shortfall prompted the Chinese government to end the one-child policy in 2015. Families are now allowed to have 2 children. Most population growth is occurring and is expected to continue to occur in less developed countries, with African countries leading the way. China will likely peak to close to 1.46 billion in about the year 2030. It was 1.43 billion in the year 2019 and is expected to shrink slightly after that due to an aging population. Demographers predict India will peak around 2060 at 1.65 billion. Despite reaching replacement fertility in the 1990s, Kerala's population is still growing at a natural rate of 6.7 per 1,000 people, and experts say it will take several years more to reach zero population growth. And that brings us to infographic number 4 on page 149. The fastest growing regions are those with a youthful or very young population. And moving on to the second part of infographic 4, age structure diagrams show the distribution of males and females of a population in various age classes. The width of a bar shows the percentage of the total population that is in each gender and age class. The more young people in a population, the more population momentum it has. It will continue to grow for some time. The more people of reproductive age, the higher the growth rate, but this measure is also influenced by income. Growth rates decline as income increases. And that brings us to key concept number 5. Helping low-income countries develop economically may spur a demographic transition that could decrease population growth rates. So demographers and economists weren't entirely wrong for believing that economic stability would reduce population growth. In fact, there is so much evidence of this relationship that there's a name for it: the demographic transition. The demographic transition is a hypothetical model that describes the expected drop in once high population growth rates as economic conditions improve the quality of life in a population. It tends to happen as a country's economy changes from pre-industrial to post-industrial, when low birth and death rates replace high birth and death rates. So the demographic transition helps demographers understand a population's growth patterns and predict future ones. It has 4 stages. 1. Pre-industrial. In the pre-industrial stage, birth and death rates are high but similar. So population growth is slow or stationary. Population size is low. 2. Industrializing. In the industrializing stage, better conditions lead to lower death rates. However, birth rates remain high, resulting in rapid population growth. 3. Mature industrial. In the mature industrial stage, birth rates begin to fall. Though they still outnumber deaths, population is still growing, but at a slower rate. And 4thly, post-industrial. At the post-industrial stage, birth rates are similar to death rates, so population growth stabilizes at a new, higher population size. So industrialized countries that reach or are close to reaching replacement fertility after having a higher population growth rate tend to have strong economies, high levels of education for citizens, and good healthcare systems. The United States, Japan, and most of the European Union are examples of countries that are post-industrial. The reasons that economic stability begets population stability are believed to be tied to better health. Economic stability improves access to health care and prenatal care so that death rates, including childhood mortality, decline. As it becomes clear that more children will make it to adulthood, desired fertility declines, and the total fertility rate along with it. The lag between the drop in death rates and the subsequent drop in birth rates results in a higher overall population, but once birth rates decline, such that birth rates equal death rates, the population stabilizes at its new size. To be sure, the transition is not uniform or smooth and steady. Within transitioning societies, birth rates tend to drop faster for those with higher incomes, and populations tend to increase for a while after economic conditions improve, not only because of population momentum, but also because it takes a while for cultural norms to shift toward desired fertility and smaller families. Recent evidence suggests that India is now passing through the demographic transition, moving into the later phase of stage 3, that is the mature industrial phase, as a result of major economic development and growth. Kerala made it through the demographic transition in the early 1900s, well ahead of the rest of India, without first ushering in an era of economic growth. This was an amazing fact, to be sure, but it came with some serious side effects. Because the economy remains stagnant, university graduates have a hard time finding work that benefits their educational status. As a result, unemployment remains high, and the state itself is suffering from brain drain, with many of its most talented sons and daughters seeking employment elsewhere. Meanwhile, the state's commitment to health and education for all has left it with significant budget deficits. Indeed, even as development experts around the world look to Kerala as the model of how to do more with less, some wonder if the state's victory over population growth will prove sustainable. Can the Kerala model survive even in Kerala? Or will it be remembered chiefly as an isolated and short-term outbreak from a prison of poverty? And that brings us to infographic number 5 on page 151. Some industrialized nations have gone through the demographic transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates, giving them a stable population. Demographers are considering adding a 5th stage, declining, for those populations experiencing more deaths than births. It is unclear whether industrialization will produce the same pattern in all developing countries. Still, steps to improve the quality of life and decrease death rates are important worldwide, even if other measures are needed to slow birth rates. And that brings us to key concept number 6. In many cases, addressing social justice issues, especially improving the well-being of women and children, is the key to reducing total fertility and reaching zero population growth. So when analyzing a population's dynamics, demographers look to see if a relationship or correlation exists between various demographic factors, like between income and the total fertility rate. Some correlations, like that of the total fertility rate and desired fertility rate, are positive. Both factors track together. As one increases or decreases, so does the other. The total fertility rate and the use of contraception show a negative correlation. As one increases, the other decreases. Demographers have put forth many explanations for Kerala's unprecedented decline in population growth rate in the absence of substantial economic growth, but one factor stands out among the others. Kerala also had India's highest overall literacy rate at 94% and the highest literacy rate for women by far. In fact, of all the factors that Sen and his colleagues cited for Kerala's high quality of life and decreasing population rates, like land reform, educational access, child welfare, and health care, education ranked as the most significant. And not just education of women in particular. So it turns out that education of girls and economic opportunities for women correlate with lower population growth in many regions, and it's not difficult to see why. Education empowers women to take more control over their lives and their fertility by demanding and using birth control, for example, or by marrying later or delaying childbirth while pursuing a career. The typical Keralan woman marries somewhat later than her Indian counterpart, age 24 compared to 20. So the key factor may be the effect this has on the health of children, because women who earn more can better support their families. Childhood mortality tends to decline. In Kerala, women's income has not necessarily increased with education, but that income is more dependable, making it easier for women to predictably care for their children, and women there make regular use of free birth control that is offered to them. They tend to choose smaller families now that they are less worried about some of their progeny dying young, and because they want all of their children to have private schooling, a university education, and so on, something that's much easier with 2 children than with 7. Education for women is just one of many social justice issues that strongly influence desired fertility rate and total fertility rate. Others include access to health care and birth control, and land and legal reforms that enable women to own property and run businesses. All of these factors affect the less privileged members of society the most. In the United States, the high infant mortality rate, deaths to children under 1 year of age, of 6 deaths per 1,000 births, relative to other developed countries between 1 and 4 in the most developed countries, manifests itself mainly in those living in poverty. Babies born into poverty are much more likely to die than those born to U.S. families that can afford decent health care. Most of the countries with lower infant mortality rates have some form of national health care system. The greatest value of Sen's work may have been to show how addressing these social issues can significantly reduce population growth. It was on this understanding that the United Nations Development Program developed a new metric with which to shape sustainable development policies, human development indicators. These indicators have been instrumental in the drafting of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. A quality education and gender equality are goals 4 and 5. But that correlation between social justice and curbing population growth depends heavily on cultural pronatalist factors. For example, access to contraceptives can help drive the total fertility rate down, but only in regions where there is unmet need for birth control. In some places, religious beliefs prevent increased access to birth control options from having an impact. Elsewhere, other cultural forces that lead people to want bigger families, it's not always about high childhood mortality or the need for farm labor, weigh heavily. Kerala's culture gave it 3 distinct advantages in spreading education and health care. First, the state was always matrilineal, that is, power, land, and money passed down through daughters rather than sons, and women, especially those of higher castes, were routinely educated. So when progressive leaders began extending that right to poorer communities, the culture at large was primed for it. Second, there was no real divide between urban and rural areas in Kerala. So unlike other states in India and across the developing world, schools and health clinics didn't get concentrated in cities, but instead were accessible to both groups. And third, the state boasted an above-average concentration of high-quality missionary schools that catered to people of all faiths. And that brings us to infographic number 6 on page 153. Addressing pronatalist pressures can help reduce population growth rates. This often involves bringing social justice to women and families so they can better care for themselves and their children. The graphs that I am showing you show the correlation between total fertility rate, the average number of children per female, and 3 important factors: childhood mortality. Infant mortality is closely correlated to poverty. Therefore, actions that decrease poverty in a population should also reduce infant mortality and that population's growth rate. And in this slide, we see the graph for the education of women and the total fertility rate. Fertility declines as educational opportunities for girls and women increase. This means that funding for education and job opportunities for women can be very effective at lowering the total fertility rate. And on this graph, we see access to birth control versus the total fertility rate. Access to contraceptives and family planning have been effective in many areas of the world. However, in countries with high desired fertility, such as Niger, providing contraceptives may have little impact on the total fertility rate. And that brings us to our key concept number 7. The number of people Earth can support depends on how many resources each uses. We may have already exceeded our planet's carrying capacity by using more resources than it can replace in the long term. So in the decades since Kerala achieved nearly 100% literacy and sub-replacement fertility, the state has been heralded far and wide as a model of sustainable development. Demographers and development workers the world over have been studying and discussing the Kerala model for what it might teach them about how to achieve similar successes in other countries with bulging populations and small economics. But some experts say that Kerala's most valuable lessons may actually be for wealthy countries, not poor ones. Kerala suggests a way out of two problems simultaneously. Not only the classic development goal of more food in bellies and more shoes on feet, but also the emerging equally essential task of living lightly on the earth, using fewer resources and creating less waste. In other words, not only has Kerala succeeded at reducing the number of people who consume resources, it did so without increasing the consumption of resources by each member of its society. In doing so, it did not exceed its carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the maximum population size that a given environment can support. The size of that capacity is determined by a range of forces, including the amount of crucial resources available and the rate at which those resources can be replenished if they are renewable, as well as the rate of resource consumption by the population. The amount of waste generated plays a role too. If waste is generated faster than the ecosystem can assimilate it, the ecosystem will suffer and the rate of resource replenishment will decrease. In other words, a degraded ecosystem can sustain far fewer people than a well-maintained, healthy one. When a population size exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment, the environment is said to be overpopulated. Some parts of the world are certainly overpopulated today. They have exceeded the carrying capacity for their region, and as a result, they face food and water scarcity issues as well as problems managing their waste. But whether a given population qualifies as overpopulated is not a simple question of numbers. Take the planet as a whole. 8.1 billion is such a large number it can be difficult to comprehend. Is this too many? Are we overpopulated? The answer depends on several factors, including how many resources each of those people uses and how much waste they produce. So one measure of our impact on the environment is the ecological footprint, expressed as the area needed to provide resources and assimilate waste, usually quantified in global hectares. That is a metric that normalizes different types of land and aquatic areas in terms of average global productivity. The more resources each person takes and the more waste each person generates, the greater their ecological footprint. And the greater the ecological footprint for an average person living in a given environment, the lower that environment's carrying capacity. In other words, more people can be supported if they consume less compared to a population where per capita consumption is high. Since 1980, the population has increased by more than 3 billion people and per capita consumption has increased by 15%. Both contribute to our rising footprint. By comparing the ecological footprint to the amount of productive area available on Earth, we can determine if we are living sustainably, that is, within the means of the planet to replace what we took. Researchers at the Global Footprint Network have done just that. Though the footprint varies widely from country to country, they have estimated that the overall ecological footprint of humans currently exceeds what Earth can sustainably support in the long run. We manage to live beyond our means by using resources that should remain in place to replenish what can be taken sustainably. By taking more now than Earth can replace at its own ecological pace, we are reducing Earth's carrying capacity for the future. To give an example, if you cut down all the trees in your forest faster than they can regrow, before long, you no longer have a forest. Can you wait for it to recover? Have you left it in a condition that allows it to recover? Carrying capacity itself is a moving target. It tends to increase with technological innovations and decrease with environmental damage. In general, less developed regions tend to have a greater number of people but a smaller per capita ecological footprint, and more developed regions tend to have fewer people, each with a large ecological footprint. As of right now, there are over 8 billion people on the planet Earth, and at least some experts say that the number already exceeds the planet's carrying capacity. In any case, whether we stabilize at 10 or 16 billion or somewhere in between will depend on how quickly we can achieve replacement fertility worldwide. And that brings us to infographic number 7 on page 155, a comparison of humanity's ecological footprint, that is what we take, to the Earth's productivity capacity, that is what is available, can reveal whether our population has exceeded the long-term carrying capacity of the planet Earth. Current assessments suggest that we use resources faster than the Earth's systems can replace them. A 2018 estimate puts humanity's footprint at 1.7 Earths, and our footprint is increasing. The overshoot is caused by both our sheer numbers and the rise in per capita resource use, especially in developing countries. And in this slide, we see the per capita footprint comparison. This graph suggests that the human population as a whole has overshot carrying capacity, but there is a great disparity in the resources used and waste produced among countries of the world. The per capita footprint of developing countries is much lower in general than that of the developed ones. And that brings us to this chapter's core message. The human population is greater than 8.1 billion. Human impact on the environment is due to the sheer numbers of people or humans living on the planet and the impact per person. In order to solve the problems, we must understand and solve the problems of high birth rates, and this involves social justice. So let's summarize our chapter. In the decades since Kerala achieved 100% literacy and sub-replacement fertility, the state has been heralded far and wide as a model of sustainable development. Not only has Kerala succeeded at reducing the number of people who consume resources, it did so without increasing the consumption of resources by each member of its society. In doing so, it maintained its carrying capacity. Perhaps the Kerala model will help other populations reduce their total fertility rate and replacement fertility. Some experts say that the current human population of over 8 billion already exceeds the planet's carrying capacity. Whether we stabilize at 11 billion or 16 billion or somewhere in between will depend on how quickly we achieve replacement fertility worldwide.